The prison infirmary at Coldwater Correctional didn't smell like other parts of the facility. It smelled like antiseptic and something older underneath. Something no amount of bleach could fully erase. The fluorescent lights ran 24 hours a day, casting the same flat white glow at 3 in the afternoon as at 3 in the morning, and after a while, the nurses stopped noticing. Time blurred in there. Shifts bled into each other. You learned to read the sounds instead of the clocks, the hiss of the ventilation system, the rhythm of monitors, the distant clang of a cell door somewhere deep in the block. Nessa Briard had worked the overnight infirmary shift at Coldwater for 2 years, and she had become, to most people's estimation, part of the furniture. She was the kind of woman people looked past. Not unpleasant to look at, just unremarkable in the way a beige wall is unremarkable. Medium height, dark hair kept in a plain braid, no jewelry, no makeup, scrubs that had been washed so many times they'd gone from navy blue to a faded almost gray. She moved quietly. She spoke quietly. When the corrections officers came in for their nightly check, they'd sometimes startle when they realized she was standing 2 feet away. They hadn't heard her come in. She was patient with the inmates in her care. She was precise with her medications. She followed protocol to the letter, and occasionally beyond it, and she never complained. The warden had once described her in a performance review she was never meant to see as reliable and unobtrusive. She'd found the review on the printer by accident and had considered, briefly, whether to be offended. She'd decided it wasn't worth the energy. What no one at Coldwater knew, what no one in this chapter of her life knew, was that 6 years ago, Nessa Briard had been a field trauma surgeon attached to a special operations unit in a theater of conflict she still wasn't allowed to name in casual conversation. She had operated under fire, in the back of moving vehicles, in buildings with no power and no sterile field, with improvised tools and the singular kind of focus that only comes from knowing that if your hands shake, the person on the table dies. She had been, for 4 years, very good at keeping people alive in situations specifically designed to kill them. She'd left. Quietly, the way she did everything now. A medical discharge, a relocation, a reinvention. Coldwater was as far from that life as she could get while still doing the only thing she knew how to do. She took care of people. She didn't ask questions. She kept her head down. That was the plan anyway. The night it fell apart started like every other night. She clocked in at 11, checked the log from the day shift, restocked the cabinet by bed 3, and noted that inmate Marcus Dunby in bed 7 was running a low-grade fever that bore watching. The day nurse, a young woman named Petra, who was still learning that good charting was the difference between a bad night and a catastrophic one, had logged it as mild, possible environmental, and moved on. Nessa added a note, ordered a blood panel, and set a timer to check again in 90 minutes. At 12:40, a man she hadn't seen before walked into the infirmary. She noticed him before she looked up. Footsteps too deliberate for this hour, not the heavy, bored tread of a corrections officer doing rounds, not the shuffle of an inmate being escorted in. This was someone moving with a destination in mind, wearing the pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going, and had already decided what he was going to do when he got there. She looked up. He was wearing a white coat, visitor badge clipped to the lapel, the right kind, facility physician's auxiliary, teal stripe, laminated. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of angular face that suggested, at a glance, authority. A stethoscope hung around his neck. He carried a medical bag that was slightly too new, slightly too clean for this environment. "Nurse," he said. Not a question, not particularly a greeting, just an acknowledgement of category. "Doctor," she said, equally neutral. "I don't have you on the overnight consultation list." He smiled, the way men like him smile when they're mildly inconvenienced by the existence of process. Last-minute addition. Dr. Keene was pulled for a family matter. Administration called me in. "I'm here to check on the patient in Bay 9. Bay 9 was where they were keeping the man she'd been thinking about all evening. His name, according to the intake sheet, was Leonard Sharp, and he had been transferred to Coldwater's infirmary 6 days ago, following what the paperwork described as injuries sustained during transport. He was a federal witness. That much had been communicated, indirectly, through 3 different bureaucratic channels. each one more oblique than the last. There were 2 federal marshals posted outside the infirmary's main entrance. His chart had an access restriction flag she'd never seen before on a patient in this facility. She had not been told what he had witnessed. She had been told, clearly and without room for interpretation, that his medical care was her responsibility and his security was not her problem. She thought about that now. The doctor in front of her was smiling. His badge was the right kind. His coat was the right kind. His stethoscope was the right brand. She'd clocked that in the first 3 seconds because her brain was still wired to inventory, still cataloged the world in terms of what was real and what was being performed. The stethoscope was Littman, Cardiology 3, good equipment, but it was hanging wrong, too far to the right, tubing twisted in a way that suggested it had been put on recently and in a hurry by someone who didn't usually wear one. "Your name?" she said pleasantly, already moving toward the computer terminal. "Dr. Hawkins, Regional Medical Authority." He was already moving toward the Bay 9 curtain. "I just need to log you in," she said, which was true. "Protocol for restricted patients requires counter-signature." He paused, just for a half second. "Of course!" She typed slowly. She typed the name he'd given her. Nothing. She tried the auxiliary physician roster. Nothing there either. She tried a broader search, the kind that the system's interface didn't make obvious. You had to know the field labels to find it. Dr. Hawkins appeared on no list at Coldwater Correctional or its affiliated medical authority. She did not let any of this land on her face. "System's a little slow tonight," she said, with the particular sigh of someone who has accepted institutional inefficiency as a feature rather than a bug. "Go ahead. I'll finish logging you once it catches up." He went through the curtain. Nessa moved to the far end of the nursing station, slow and unhurried, the way she did everything here. She reached under the edge of the desk. Where? Because she had asked for it, quietly, after a conversation with the facility security coordinator she'd had about 6 months ago, and which no one had followed up on. There was a hardwired panic button, direct line to the corrections command center. Not the intercom, not the phone, direct. She pressed it once, held it for 2 seconds, released. Then she picked up a medication clipboard and walked toward Bay 9. The man in Bay 9, Leonard Sharp, was not asleep, which was the first surprise. His eyes were open and tracking the ceiling, and when the curtain shifted and the man in the white coat stepped closer to his bed, something in his face changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The particular recognition of a person who has been expecting something and is now watching it arrive. Nessa came in behind the man who called himself Hawkins, clipboard in hand, expression professionally attentive. "Just need to get a quick set of vitals while you're here, Mr. Sharp," she said. Hawkins glanced at her, assessed, decided she was furniture. "That can wait," he said. "Protocol for restricted patients," she said, not moving. "Vitals any time a new clinician accesses the file. It's a federal requirement." She held his gaze with the particular blankness of a woman who had sat through 9 hours of bureaucratic briefings and had every procedure memorized. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She looked back. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about 4 years of operating under fire that never quite left you. Her hands did not forget. He looked away first. She moved to the opposite side of the bed from him, placed 2 fingers on Leonard's wrist, and looked at her watch. Under the cover of that gesture, she pressed Leonard's wrist once, lightly, and held eye contact with him for just a moment. Long enough to see him understand that she knew. She noted the pulse, logged it on the clipboard, and said, "Blood pressure next," reaching for the cuff. Hawkins had opened his medical bag. He was taking too long about it, too deliberate, too controlled, the careful movements of someone managing the adrenaline they were trying not to show. She registered this without looking directly at him. She'd learned to read the periphery. You didn't survive 4 years in the field by looking at things head-on. She got the blood pressure cuff onto Leonard's arm. She pumped it. The machine beeped. 140/92, she announced, to no one in particular. Elevated. "I'm going to need to note that." "Nurse." Hawkins's voice had changed slightly. "I need you to step out." "I can't," she said, still writing. "Federal witness protocol." A registered nurse must be present during any medical procedure. It's a liability requirement. If you want, I can call the marshal on duty to verify. She said all of this with the energy of someone describing paint drying. No threat in it, no alarm. Just the flat recitation of a person who had memorized the rules because rules were what the job ran on. He looked at her again, this time longer. She was still writing. She'd filled half a page with legitimate vitals and was now annotating a follow-up note about Leonard's potassium levels, which were, in fact, worth monitoring. Hawkins set his bag on the chair by the bed. He reached in. He wasn't reaching for anything medical. She had already known this. But now she watched him confirm it. And she tracked the angle of his arm and the depth of his reach and understood what he was going to bring up. The monitor on Leonard's right began an irregular rhythm. She'd set it to sensitive before coming in, a choice she'd made 30 seconds ago that had looked like routine adjustment. The alarm was piercing, loudly, emphatically, the specific frequency that cleared a room of casual bystanders and brought trained personnel running. Hawkins flinched. His hand came up empty, reflexive. Even someone who wasn't supposed to stopped in the face of a screaming cardiac monitor. The sound bypassed the thinking brain and hit something older. That was the 3 seconds she needed. She didn't reach for a weapon. There was nothing she could use as a weapon in the conventional sense. What she did reach for was the defibrillator cart behind her, which she'd positioned that way during the first walkthrough of her shift, because she always positioned the defibrillator cart where she could reach it, because that was the job. She grabbed the paddles. She didn't charge them. She turned to Hawkins. "Back away from the bed," she said, and her voice, for the first time since he'd walked in, was not the voice of the furniture. It was the voice of someone who had intubated patients in moving vehicles, in zero visibility, and had kept her voice level the entire time, and because was contagious. And calm was the only currency that mattered. He looked at her hands, at the paddles. "This is not worth what they're paying you," she said. Something moved in his face, calculation. He had come in here with a plan, and the plan did not include the mousy overnight nurse holding defibrillator paddles and looking at him like he was a problem she was already solving. He made a decision. She saw him make it. He reached into the bag again, this time for what he'd originally intended, and she charged the paddles and said, clearly, and without any heat at all, "The charge on these is enough to cause involuntary muscle contraction and loss of motor control. I've used them 3 times this year. I know exactly what they do." Pause. "The command center was alerted 40 seconds ago," she added. "The marshal at the door would have heard the monitor. You have maybe 60 seconds before this room has 4 more people in it." Through the thin curtain, she heard the sound of the infirmary door at the far end of the corridor. The specific hydraulic sigh of it opening. Footsteps. More than one person. Hawkins heard it too. He looked at her one more time. She was still holding the paddles. Her hands had not moved. He left the bag on the chair. He backed toward the curtain. He pulled it aside and walked in the direction of the secondary exit, the one that led to the medication corridor, which he clearly believed was a way out. It wasn't. The medication corridor dead-ended at a locked door that required a keycard she wore on a lanyard around her neck. She heard him discover this 30 seconds later, in the form of a fist hitting a door that did not open, followed by the sound of 2 corrections officers who had been directed there by the command center, reaching him before he found another option. She set the paddles back on the cart. She took 2 slow, even breaths. She picked up the clipboard. Leonard Sharp was looking at her from the bed. "You're a nurse," he said. "I'm a nurse," she agreed. "Who did you used to be?" She considered the question. Outside there was noise. Radio chatter. Boots. The efficient language of people containing a situation. She'd need to give a statement. She'd need to walk through the timeline. There would be federal personnel involved before morning, and they would ask questions, and she would answer them accurately and without embellishment. "Someone who's very good at taking care of people," she said. He looked at the defibrillator cart. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I got that." The aftermath took 4 hours and left her with a witness statement, a commendation form she hadn't asked for, and a conversation with a federal marshal named Taggart, who had the particular energy of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about a situation. "You pressed the panic button at 12:43, he said, looking at his notes. "Before you had visual confirmation of a weapon. I had behavioral confirmation," she said. "The stethoscope was wrong." He looked up. The stethoscope, the way he was wearing it. "You put on a stethoscope every day. It sits a certain way." He'd put his on in the last hour. Probably in a car, in the dark. Taggart wrote something down. Then he looked at her again with the careful look of someone deciding how many follow-up questions to ask. "The warden's file says you're a level 2 RN, 2 years at this facility, before that general hospital work in." "That file is accurate," she said pleasantly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and wrote something else down. She was released at 6:15, just as the morning shift was coming in. Petra arrived with coffee from the machine down the hall and a look on her face that suggested the rumor mill had already done 2 full rotations. "Is it true you held him off with the defibrillator?" Petra asked, with the tone of someone hoping the answer was yes. "I presented him with information," Nessa said. "He made a reasonable decision. That's not a no." "It's not," she agreed. She went home. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment 6 minutes from the facility, and it smelled like coffee and old books. And there was a photograph on the shelf above the kitchen tables that she had never shown anyone. 4 people in non-identifying gear in a location that looked like a lot of other locations if you didn't know what you were looking at. She was on the left, in the back. You could only tell it was her from the posture, the way she stood with her weight slightly forward, ready to move. She made coffee. She sat at the table. The thing about that life, the life before the flat white lights and the faded scrubs and the reliable and unobtrusive, was that it hadn't ended because she'd failed at it. She'd been good at it. She had been very, very good at it. She'd left because staying had started to cost her something she couldn't quantify and couldn't afford to keep losing. She'd thought, sometimes, that the quiet life was a kind of hiding. A deliberate erasure. She looked at the photograph. She thought about Leonard Sharp's face when she'd pressed the panic button and then walked in anyway. The way he'd understood, before she'd said anything, that she was on his side. The way she'd understood, without needing to be told, what kind of trouble was in that room. Some things didn't erase. They just waited. She finished her coffee and went to sleep with the particular ease of someone whose hands had not shaken, who had done the thing that needed doing, and who knew, without needing anyone to tell her, that she'd done it right. She was back on shift at 11.